We're going to talk about school districts and innovation. Some might think of that as a paradox. We're going to talk about innovation and equity, another paradox. We have a really cool panel that knows a lot about this topic from many different angles. But I'm going to start with you and a few of your questions, and then we'll introduce the panel. So when you think about school district innovation, particularly when it comes to the question of equity, what questions come to mind?
What are we waiting for?
What are we waiting for?
Yeah, what are we waiting for? Why are we stagnated? Why are we in cement? What's taking so long?
Good. Maybe why is it so hard? Yeah.
Are we ready to address the real issues around equity, and not at a lip service level, but at a changing hearts and minds and practice level?
Okay. Interesting. Hi. Yeah. School districts and equity.
Addressing the opportunity gap and ensuring that all schools are up to the same caliber that we expect, whether it's in a high socioeconomic area or low socioeconomic area.
So I think that question's really interesting. Innovation itself creates inequity because you're doing something cool at one place and it's not everywhere. So I think for me that leads to the question of innovation and equity. Let's see, somebody over here had a hand up. Hi.
Institutionalized racism?
In all of its forms, everywhere, and how that gets in the way, right, in terms of what are we waiting for? How do we address it? How do we have the conversation about it? Yes.
So there are lots of places having conversations and doing things that they think are providing equity, but how do we provide access to close the achievement gap so that kids can make themselves avail themselves of the other opportunities? For example, just increasing AP courses in a school is not equitable if kids can't access the curriculum. So what do we do to close the achievement gap at the same time so that we can give kids access to those opportunities that are in their schools?
Okay, another question of access. Jinsu, when you think about this, what comes to mind?
Maybe on the spot right again. I think again, like why hasn't this been baked in from the beginning? What are the obstacles from doing it, and how do we make sure it's a priority when we innovate, so it's not a paradox on there?
We've talked about a bunch of issues. I'm interested in when you think of innovation, what innovations are you thinking about? What would be high on the list?
So I'm concerned about why we have one set of expectations and goals for our white, wealthy, continuing generation students around pursuing liberal arts degrees and having that kind of holistic experience, and then another set of expectation for our underrepresented, lower class students in terms of skill development.
Differential expectations? Yes, I'm going to come around over here. Yes.
And just to follow up with that, like how do we address implicit bias and help educators see what's really possible for all students?
Great. Thank you. Jinsu, you got another one? Shout it out.
I wonder about the personalized learning when we think about, like we often think about academic skills and tailoring needs for academic students, but how do we make sure that we honor background, heritage, and make sure that's part of curriculum and learning as well?
We don't have anybody from Digital Promise here, do we? Oh, hi, Kim. Kim and I and Karen Cater from Digital Promise did a session this morning where we talked about their learner positioning system, which does this beautiful visual job of surfacing all the research that we know about how learners are different, right? So this, I think, really gets to the question of how do we appreciate all the differences between learners. Hi.
Good to see you too. I'm interested in innovations related to the preschool space and the antecedents of equity that come from that space and how districts are engaging in that.
So preschool? Okay. We have a great podcast coming out about all the innovations in Tulsa that are expanding access to preschool, so it's terrific. But we could expand that to what happens after school, summer school. Julia Freeland Fisher from the Christensen Institute has a book coming out this summer on social capital, and she argues that in school and out of school, there are rich differences in the networks that young people are able to build. Yes.
Thank you. I'm interested in exploring healing as innovation and how we create schools and districts such that people of color, students of color in particular, can heal from racial trauma.
Thank you. Pam Cantor did a webinar with Digital Promise last week about the trauma that extended exposure to poverty creates, and we published on Getting Smart a great research summary that summarized Pam's work about a week ago. So thank you. A rich view of all the issues school has to deal with. Anything else? Yeah, let's get a couple more. Innovations, what kind? What questions?
Yeah, I think that last comment got to that we probably have different things in our brain that count as innovation. So thinking about innovation and equity, innovation for equity might actually call forth different things that qualify as innovation, and some previous innovations might end up being distractions from equity rather than movements toward, and I think that'd be a great thing for the panel and the audience to explore.
Thank you.
Can I add some? How about how do we innovate our spaces to make them more welcoming to people from all walks of life?
Thank you.
I'm wondering how far we're willing and able to go in innovation when we're working within systems like districts and schools and buildings and curricula that have been passed down for generations and don't maybe necessarily fit the exact needs that we're talking about now. So where do we say the limit is and why?
Wow, that's a good list. Yes.
I'm interested in career exploration and how some innovation in that direction, how we make sure, can innovation help us not pass along inequity within schools just down the pathway into the workforce?
I actually think guidance is the new gap, that it might be the most important gap that we face, maybe after sort of really recognizing who we are and where we come from and what we've been through, then the where are we going and how are we going to get there. I think it's getting more and more complicated to understand the employment landscape and to get ready for it. So I think this is a profound source of inequity. But I don't think any kid in America is getting good, adequate guidance today. All right, one more? Yes. Yeah.
I think my students get good guidance, yes.
That's good.
Thank you. Not many students.
Just to add to the mix, nobody's mentioned it yet, but predictive analytics, as we're talking about big data, what are some of the potential benefits and pitfalls as we think about that?
That's a pretty good list, right?
Yes.
All right, we have a super interesting panel, diverse experience and geography. Caroline Hill.
Yes.
Are you still at City Bridge?
A little bit, yes.
Yeah.
Do a lot of things.
So Caroline does a lot. I think everybody up here does. Caroline knows a lot about designing powerful schools. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Where do you want to dive in? There's a whole bunch of interesting entry points.
I think I started to write down a lot. There was a big notion about like our inheritance and like as a country what we've inherited. So I think it's really important when we have any conversation about innovation and equity that we really start to look at the problem that we inherited, right? And the problem that we inherited wasn't just the factory model of education. We inherited the factory model of education and segregation. We inherited seat time and generational poverty. So we cannot necessarily use a very reductive lens and solve for factory model without saying, like, if we don't solve for this segregation thing, we're not going to really solve or change the experience of most of the students in the country. If we don't solve the generational poverty thing, we can fix seat time. We can have awesome, powerfully analytical personalization tools, but we're not solving or changing the life experience for many Americans, right, or many students. So I think we've created this problem, and we've had the ingenuity and the courage to put a man on another celestial body, AKA the moon. We can solve this if we have the courage to solve it. So I think any conversation about innovation and equity, it's like, how do we expand the boundaries of the conversation to say, like, no, there are two things we have to hold at the same time, because we didn't just inherit one.
There's lots of paradox here, but can we agree? I wonder if there's the beginning of a shared supposition on this panel that new school development is a critical form of innovation. You'd agree with that?
I think it can be if we're able to challenge the core parts of schools, right? I think if schools are continuing to be designed the same way they were designed before, they're only going to reproduce the same results. So I think we have to have the courage to say, like, what are the core elements of the design that we need to push on and challenge and rethink in different ways?
So one of the issues that I want to put in the parking lot right now, because Tommy's going to answer it for us, is the question of new school development. So I think new school development is probably the most important form of innovation. It's a bundle of innovations that we make available. The problem is, you open one school at a time, and somebody gets access and somebody doesn't. So it by itself creates inequity. And so I want to have Tommy tell us how to avoid that. Kathy.
Yes.
The Tiger Woods Foundation.
TGR Foundation.
How do you think about innovation and equity?
So I wholeheartedly agree with Caroline, actually, that, and I come from a public school background myself. I was a school principal. And one of the ways that we looked at kind of developing the TGR Learning Lab model was to try to turn education on its head and do something different that made sense for kids. I think the other piece of we have to have courage, we have to be willing to go outside the boundaries and challenge the policies and things that are in place that are telling us we have to design something this way, in this fashion. And we really need to wad it up, throw it out, and start all over again. And I think that's one of the things that we've done with our learning labs, is to really go and take a look at what students are learning now, what do they want to learn, and where are they going to apply it, and then try to connect all of those dots along the spectrum so that there is a continuum of learning, preschool through after school and into workforce, that actually creates a pipeline. We have educational issues, we have an economic issue in this country as well that we are not talking about at all in education. Mm-hmm. When we do our job well, we are actually reinvesting in our own community, reinvesting in our economy, and we're actually going to be a stronger country because of it. We have no choice but to do something different than we're doing right now.
Caroline talked about the inequity that exists in our communities, right? And good schools are probably the best answer that I know of to deal with inequity, and yet they're not going to solve all the community challenges that we face, right?
They could. So this is what I think, because I know you're looking right at me. So I think, like, when I think about equity, it's not just about access, right? It's also about how do we create and restore and have the relationships that dismantle systems of oppression. Mm-hmm. And systems of oppression are rooted in our routine separation. So we can have an AP class and make sure that our schools are great, but if you have an all-rich white school and an all-poor black school, that is going to be inherently inequitable because the schools are separate, and we know that separate is not equal, right? We have to figure out ways to bring people who are different together, and then give the access and create that restoration. I think that's what our country hasn't done.
So one reason I wanted to open the door to talking about inequities in communities as well as schools is some of us were just in a panel discussion about the implications of artificial intelligence. And it seems clear to me that increasing inequity is inevitable. And I hate to say that, but I think it's inevitable that machine learning, smart tools is going to aggregate wealth and accelerate it. And so I think we're going to have to deal with both the inequity in our communities and in our schools. You buy that?
I think it doesn't have to be where we end up. It might be where we start.
Yeah. I just don't, I want to agree, let's not put this all on schools, right? It's a powerful anecdote, but it's an and both.
Oh, absolutely. Schools are a part of a bigger engine that's working. Yeah, it's not all on schools.
So Tommy, you, we first met in the parking lot in Venice. Remember that?
It might have been, yes, that's right.
When he was a high school principal,
yes.
25 years ago or something. So you learned a lot.
10 years ago.
You learned a lot in Los Angeles about innovations in learning. And as you walked into Boston and had those fresh set of eyes on the situation, what did you see and how did you think about the role that innovation would play in your agenda and what you wanted to get done in Boston?
Yeah, I want to build on something Carolyn was saying. We often feel like with the communities we have most marginalized, we have to intervene, we have to provide more intervention. But that comes from a premise that there's deficits that have to be fixed, right? And we're never going to close these opportunity achievement gaps if we just think we're going to give the same old things to the communities that we have most marginalized, that have worked for a different community, and that it will close opportunity gaps. It has to be about acceleration. And the way you accelerate, you have to give something that is dramatically different, dramatically more innovative. And so for me, I think for all of us, the challenge is where we start needs to be the places that need it the most. And we have to get better and more nuanced in determining where do we start this work. And when we look at need as school systems, we typically look at special ed, ELD, maybe like a reading level, but we're not looking at other factors in need, such as community factors. What is the crime activities in a neighborhood? What is the agency of people who live in a community? What is the educational attainment? And we can become more and more nuanced in how we look at actual need. That helps us triangulate where we actually have to start doing the work. And so, for example, we're going to be doing some work with MIT to redesign a school in Dorchester for an open enrollment school in Boston Public Schools. The open enrollment schools are schools that serve the most marginalized of young people in the city of Boston. All the more affluent students go to our exam schools. But we're going to redesign that school through a 2-year design process to make that experience look like an MIT undergrad experience. And that will be something that will be radically different from what anybody else in the city is getting. And so while that is only one school, we're starting with the right kids. So
there were a lot of the comments that we got earlier that talked about mindset of individuals and of the bias that our systems themselves have taken on. How have you tried to get at that in Boston?
Yeah. I came into Boston three years ago, and that was coming at right off of the kind of beginnings of Black Lives Matter startup. We were going through some major race issues in the city of Boston, like we've always done for 400 years. And it was this really unique opportunity for a new superintendent to come in whose identity is not black or white, who I joke that they don't get this in the city of Boston. But I was able to say, look, we're going to have these conversations around privilege, around biases, and let's do it. I mean, if we don't do it now, we're going to lose out on this opportunity. And because of those conversations, it's allowed us to, as a system, be able to look at our own decision-making as principals, the type of policies we were creating, and we started, we created a framework for how we make decisions with a racial equity lens. And that's been helpful for us as we decide what school are we going to start with our redesign process, how we're going to allocate money differently in the system, where are our biases in our student assignment systems. But it was a lot of heart and mind work, and there was a lot of pitfalls through that, and it was messy. But I felt that if we didn't start with ourselves as adults and individuals working alongside parents and community to have these conversations, we can't shift those bigger policy decisions in the system.
David, I want to dive into STEM. You lead a STEM lab effort. What does STEM have to do with the questions that we just got?
Yeah, so I lead a team. We do it through a nonprofit foundation called STEAM Studio Education Foundation. It's made up of MIT faculty, MIT staff, people from industry sectors. For us, we focus on 3 what we call action learning lab environments, or 3 learning communities: engineering, life sciences, and computing/new technologies. The reason we pick those 3 focus areas are those are forecasted to be the 3 biggest job growth areas in the state of Massachusetts over the next 20 years. In the state of Massachusetts today, there are 300,000 STEM-oriented job openings. The growth of these gaps of openings are growing at 7% a year, forecasted through 2026. And yet when you look at the percentage of STEM workers in Massachusetts that are Black and African American and Latino and I'm just drawing a blank on Hispanic and Latino segments, 4% of that entire STEM workforce is Black, African American, 3% is Hispanic and Latino. So on the MIT environment, those 3 arenas are really in the wheelhouse of what we do on campus. So we came up with an idea, working with the Boston Public Schools, to say, could we take all the best of the learnings, the best of the know-how in the MIT ecosystem, and how could we work with the Boston Public Schools? We also work with vocational technical schools as well, to create these in-school academies or help transform current learning models to a very hands-on, what we call mind and practice, or learning and knowing and applying in a very, very organic way. So we've been collaborating with the Boston Public Schools to work with the team there to implement a new school schedule, a new curriculum that the students spend, in essence, Monday in the classroom, Tuesday in the action learning labs, Thursday in the classroom, Friday in the labs, and then the next week we flip it. So the idea is that students are spending 50% of their classroom time on the practice, very, very tightly integrated to the core concepts and theories they're learning in the classroom. And we tie the work that the students do, in essence the projects we call tackling big problems tied to their community and society at large, with things that are tied to project-based learning. We focus more on the problems as opposed to projects. Our desire is to give kids choice so that they get to work on things that are really of interest to them. Our whole focus for grades 9 through 12 is to enable these kids that don't necessarily get the exposure to explore the possibilities that are happening on the front lines of science and technology, but not wait 10 years for it to flow into the school system. And we do that through the combination of year-long courses that are, because of the requirement of the state of Massachusetts, crash courses that are 2 weeks to 12 weeks long. The idea of crash courses is to expose the kids on the leading edge capabilities and concepts that they then apply with these 12-week action learning labs. So think of a 12-week semester or a fall, winter, spring semester. The first 3 weeks, the students will be in the crash courses, learning just enough of what they need to know to actually apply them in the confines of these very authentic projects. One of the women asked a question of around innovations. One of the most interesting innovations that I've seen coming out of the MIT ecosystem is the creation of this new framework called the Compassionate Systems Framework. One of the professors at MIT, Peter Senge, one of the leaders in the world of systems thinking that may have heard, partnered with Daniel Goleman, who wrote the book on emotional intelligence, one of the leaders in the world of social and emotional learning. They basically found that there were gaps in each of these frameworks and put together this new compassionate systems framework that integrates social and emotional learning with systems thinking and compassion. And so they've created a framework. We're training teachers on it right now. We're implementing it into school districts to use that as the kind of the guiding principles or the backbone, we call them backpack skills, that govern the state of the world in their lives, what's going on in their communities and families, to create this framework that allows them to actually tackle the subject matter in a much more dynamic way.
So Tommy, this sounds like a cool bundle of innovations. How many kids get access to that, and how do you decide where to locate them, and how are you thinking about scaling it?
So at first, probably over 500 so students will have access to this. Our high schools in Boston are fairly small, so even though it's one of our big open enrollment schools, it's only 500 students. I'm not a believer that our job is to take this model and replicate it again and replicate it again and replicate it again. I hope this model inspires other schools to do something that is just as radical and just as innovative. And our job will be to provide technical assistance to that second school. The replication and just the doing over and this kind of scaling from central office is just kind of a theory action I don't necessarily believe in anymore.
But it's got to be a little bit frustrating to have something really cool that you'd like more people to have access to, and wait, right? First question was, what's taking so long? So what do you think gets in the way once you've created an innovation that you'd like to see more kids have access to? What's
I think what
stopping
gets
you
in
from
the
going
way
faster?
is the mindset of someone who lives in 2018. We're not going to do something just because we're being told by central office to scale it. I think we're nudged to behave differently when we become inspired and when our hearts and minds are moved. So if I was another school leader, this school will serve as an inspiration for me to say, you know what, maybe I need to partner with one of our local biotech companies to do something that looks like this, but with a very different sort of pathway for young people. So another school may become the biotech pathway. And our job is to run air traffic control and provide technical assistance from the central office to help schools build the capacity to redesign and reinvent themselves. So the redesign process has to be in the DNA, not just central office, not just at MIT, but in every school leader, in every teacher, in every company that works with BPS.
I think Tommy's getting at an interesting and important point here, and I wonder if any of you would agree with that or want to add something to it. When I was a superintendent 20 years ago, you could still pretend that you could do the strategic plan and then the quote, roll it out, right? And do it to people because you had the wisdom to know what to do, right? And if that was ever possible, it's not really possible anymore. And so the new challenge is to create an innovative organization, one that innovates bottom up and top down, inside out, that's generative in nature. I think that's what you're trying to describe,
absolutely.
right?
Yep, absolutely.
Do you have the same sense or different?
Yeah, really the same. I think I worked in New York City in the Department of Ed when we were going through the small schools movement, and so I taught in a lot of that environment. And I think there's a big difference between saying that a system is fair and that all the parts of it are the same. And just because it's working really well in one school or in one community doesn't necessarily mean that's the right thing to do in the next place. So I think that what you're getting at is really important, which is the most important thing for innovation is not for it to be dictated to you. Innovation, you will necessarily kill innovation by doing that. But I think that the most important thing that has to happen is this compassion for, this interest in, and this partnership with students and their communities that allow them to help drive what happens in their buildings instead of us coming in as educators and saying, here's the innovation we're going to give you.
But I also want to talk, Tommy talked about the air traffic control function that you have to create the frame and invite District 51, Rebecca's not here, is she? Mesa County Schools had this beautiful image of building the frame and inviting people to grow into the frame. So you do still frame the sandbox within which innovation happens. And I think one of the things that we got wrong, and I'll implicate myself because I was providing most of the money for that from Gates, is that we didn't manage the innovation and encourage it to be equitably shared and rationally created. So it ended up being, I would argue, kind of a free-for-all with maybe too many different kinds of schools. So I think it's a good, tough set of questions around how to build the frame and invite people into it. Barnett, did you want to add to that?
Thank you, Tom. I'd love to build off of Tommy's comments about innovation from the inside out. Where are you making room for teachers? We like to call them teacherpreneurs, who are practicing teachers but have time and space to incubate and execute their ideas around equity?
That's a great question. And we'll start with, you want to start, Tommy, or David?
I'll just say really quick, we're experimenting with teacher mini grants. I know a lot of districts are doing this, and we're just in the beginnings of it. I think the challenge is how do you then share this in a way that is really organic throughout the system and not, I think a lot of our learning management systems are just too antiquated to be organic in nature. We need to figure out other ways that you inspire your colleagues in a large school system. And so that's going to be a challenge. Like, great to have mini grants, but how does that learning move on beyond?
So, Caroline, this is making me nervous because this feels smushy and organic. And my understanding of personalized learning, especially competency-based learning, those are engineered systems where groups of people have designed something and made agreements about how they're going to work together. And that feels like it requires a little more intentionality than organic, right?
Yeah, I would.
You live in
definitely
new school development world, right?
Yeah. I think what I would add to that is some of the work that we do in Washington, D.C. is like, for example, when a school says we want to move to personalized learning or we want to move to competency-based learning, we say, who has to be on the team to move that throughout the school? It has to be students have to be on that design team. Teachers have to be on that design team. The instructional leaders have to be on the design team. And that communication has to go up to central office. And it has to go, left and right to parents.
But the key, it's a team sport.
It's a team sport, and everyone's in the team sport thinking about the implications to the budget, implications to space, implications to schedule, and then designing small hack experiments to figure out what that's going to look like at scale. It's a team sport.
Barnett, you buy that, the idea that it's a team sport? So part of Tommy's job is to find the teacherpreneurs and create space, resources, permission, time. Right. In order to innovate.
Yeah, we did it over 4 days, over a semester.
Did you have an ad or a build or a question for one?
Well, just one of the pieces that we're getting at is, are we willing to innovate in power and distribution of power, and specifically design authority? One of the things I'm very conscious of is what's the role of the state in an innovation cycle. If the state steps in, we're most likely going to squash innovation, but that means we have to have a serious commitment to giving power, design authority, but then have mechanisms to hold folks accountable.
So this is super hard, I want to do a 60-second story to just share how hard that is. So I think back to my life 20 years ago, and on one hand, I'm making grants to Big Picture Learning and High Tech High and New Tech High and all the coolest schools in the world. Ted Sizer had sort of opened my eyes to a different way to think about how school could be. And on the other hand, I'm making grants to all the policy organizations to create what became No Child Left Behind, because I was really committed to the idea of measurement and equity, right? And that we needed a real school accountability system in order to make sure that all kids are served well. How well did that work together? Not so much, right? Right. And so I have this culpability for an assumption that we could both create measurement that was equity seeking and at the same time foster innovation. And so we have to be really careful about those things and all the unintended consequences that we create by stepping into a system. You probably feel that tension, right?
I would add that what we're measuring consistently is just a fraction of what it means to be college, career, and life ready. And it tends, I mean, it hits, for example, our immigrant students. And if you're an immigrant to this country that speaks another language, you have skills, you can critically think, but we can't measure for that currently, then we're doing injustice to that individual. So if we can do a better job of measuring the right things, maybe we can bring those two worlds together.
So this feels like a super important point, right? That I don't know, when I was a superintendent, I thought about equity as, reading, writing, and math, and a narrow view of college readiness. I think we now understand this career readiness that you wanted to explore. That's what Tommy's getting at. That's a whole different set of skills, and we don't even know how to have a conversation about what that stuff is, much less how to measure it to make sure that we're creating equitable access to it. So I think this is challenging.
Yeah.
David, jump in here.
We just finished our first year working with a vocational technical school north of Boston. It's called the Greater Lawrence Technical School. It's 83% Hispanic students, and the rest different denominations of backgrounds. Since that was the first school we worked with, it's all very teacher-driven. There are 12 teachers that went through the training program last summer. They spent the first 2 weeks at MIT and then 3 weeks working on the curriculum, getting it ready for the school year. What was really, really fascinating to us was week one, we started day one and we took all the teachers to one of the laboratories on campus called the Media Lab. It's one of the most futuristic labs on campus. It's very interdisciplinary, 27 different research projects. And then, and that really is like a Willy Wonka for adults, really at the frontiers of virtually every field in the world of science and technology, from the future of digital currency to the future of biology, go down the list. And then we did workshops throughout the week. One workshop was introducing the teachers to the world of invention, and how do scientists think about the world of invention, and how can they create projects that have that kind of theme to it. And then we took them to the MIT Garage, which are 14 student clubs and projects where the students are working on really big initiatives like the future of solar cars, Hyperloop, the high-speed transportation initiatives, the future of rocketry. And taught them, exposed this very seasoned teaching team to how to create these very applied learning experiences. At the end of that workshop segment, we took them back to the Media Lab. Again, they started day one completely overwhelmed. At the end of the workshop series, back to the Media Lab, they walked on these 6 floors. It's a big open area, labs in very glass-oriented perimeters around the building. And they really, and with all the projects going on the walls, 300 plus projects live, and they could actually see that they could actually take the projects that are going on in that lab and create high school or middle school versions of that. And they walked out of that second trip and said, we can do this. This is something we can do. MIT, will you help us through this journey? And it's been an amazing experience to see that mind shift of the teaching team that are completely driving the evolution of the learning material. They call us occasionally and say, hey, I have an idea of X. Who can you connect us with? on campus that's doing work in that area. We connect the teacher with that research team, and then it's game on.
So
And
it
it's
sounds
been
like
really remarkable.
sounds like that's a combination of vision and permission, right?
But the teachers, to the point here, the teachers have to feel that they can do it and that they have the
Right.
support system
So I
to
think
actually
that's
succeed.
what you guys were getting at, right? So this is partly a sense of what's possible, and then there's the support and permission. Do you see that when it comes to your centers?
I do see that. I think that some of what's being talked about, I kind of go back to one of the original questions, like why is it taking so long? This is why it's taking so long. This is it. We were having the discussion about like very narrow about what's happening in school, and we're not addressing any of the external issues that are impacting whether or not we're making growth. We don't have a continuum of learning. There is no learning progression that is integrating into workforce and all of that. There are resources. If you want to make change tomorrow, I think what Tommy's doing in Boston is encouraging innovation by principals, providing some loose guidelines to do that. That's wonderful. That's a great starting point, but you can't stop there. You have to continue on and figure out how does that link into the bigger picture. Is school just about learning these subjects, or is school about really preparing young people to perform and be connected to the greater world? And I don't think we really look at the entire continuum in education. One final thing I just want to say out loud, since I happen to have the floor here and lots of educators in the room. You know, a few years ago, I attended a conference that was for learning professionals in corporate America. And it was really looking at how are they leveraging technology to help retool, reskill their employees. What are the types of things they're doing? This was almost 10 years ago. We haven't even had the conversation yet in education. We don't do a good job of integrating technology and leveraging it for the benefit of accelerating education. We have to throw it all out and be willing to do something very risky and open some doors. It starts with creating the conditions for learning and for teacher growth and teacherpreneurship for sure. But it also is not forgetting all of the issues I think that Caroline brought up in the very beginning, but there are these other big looming issues. We can't just focus on one thing. It all has to, it's a comprehensive, scary, big project.
I just finished a book on school networks, and the premise is this stuff is really hard, all the stuff that we've talked about, and that one way or another schools need to work together with other like-minded schools on solutions. That might be an informal network. It could be like League of Innovative Schools. The way you work together, it might be the way New Tech Network works together, shares a platform and a learning model. In some cases, it might be a managed network of schools, but from loose and inspirational to organizational, networks might be part of the solution. You guys, any of you buy that?
I buy it, right? I think all this is going to come down to our relationships. But I think we have to be really clear. We need new relationships, and we need reordered relationships.
Yeah. Right.
Our new relationships have to be with the powerful and the powerless.
Yeah.
And we have to be willing to stay in
Right.
and be in community with each other. So I think if that's a key quality,
Yeah.
I think we're on the right
And
track.
especially if those relationships are voluntary, right, and they're value added.
I don't know about that, but I just don't know how people with power will volunteer to give that up.
All right, I'll come back. I got to get Alvin. He's been patient. Go. Keep it short.
Really short. I love the innovation, love the buy-in from teachers on that individual school level. But when we think about scale and we think about whether teachers believe and have high expectations for all kids, how do you scale innovation on that level?
So one thing we've been learning, because we've had outreach from other school districts around the country, and they're asking, well, could we do something like this, and how would we do it? One of the key learnings we have is that we think that, especially in bigger school districts, instead of assigning the teaching team to go implement this new model, we would encourage districts to allow teachers to apply that really are into it, because there's that bell curve of readiness from early adopters to those that are less risk-taking. Instead of trying to push people that may be on the right side of the curve into the left side, we think that a winning formula is to allow those that are yearning because we saw when we were interviewing for the positions in Lawrence, teachers were coming out of the woodwork saying, this is exactly why I went into education. How can I join the team?
Yeah.
So our finding was they're out there. They're not necessarily all congregated in the same school, but if you can create these pods, these embryos of opportunity, allow an opt-in from the teaching team that are organically buying in, one has a better shot of succeeding. And then our belief is that you can take these pods and hence create this very powerful network, teacher-driven.
Awesome. Closing, I have a minute, right? Yeah? All right, quick.
Just who are we innovating for and who are we innovating with? And I think that for me, 25 years ago, introduced to the achievement gap, and it was white females and black males, right? 25 years later, billions invested, white girls went up 10 points, black boys went down. And so all of these innovations, what are they for? Who are they for? How do we bring those people into the room to figure out how we make them work? Because they all sound so great, but all the innovations I hear, how to make this job better for the teachers, how to make, I don't think we don't want white girls to go up. We want them to go up. Of course we do. But we kind of wanted those black and brown boys to move. And they did the other way. And still the conversation around innovation hasn't changed to have a focus around outcomes for this group in particular.
I think we're going to close on that question. That feels like the important question, that we start and end with that question of who are we innovating for? What do we hope them? What do we hope to help them create? And then what the hell is taking so long? I really appreciate you coming. We should have had the 2-hour version of this workshop. Thank you for all your really thoughtful comments and questions, and please help me to thank our panel.